dreary night of November. Welcome, Franken readers, to Sundays with Frankenstein. Amiable cousin, such were your thoughts, mild and gentle as your own dear eyes and voice. But I was a wretch, and none ever conceived of the misery that I then endured. Amiable cousins, this is episode 5 of Sundays with Frankenstein. We will be covering the end of chapter 6 and all of chapter 7 of the 1818 edition today. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia. And joining me today again are the Ghoul Guides, Mary Going and Dr. Lauren Nixon. Welcome back, guys.
Hi. Hi, it's so nice to be back.
Awesome. Anything new?
No, I wish I could say there was. We're still in lockdown. Everything's pretty much the same.
You've still got Mervyn peeking over you there, which is good.
I do.
Everybody likes that. Mary's got her supernatural fellows back there looking at us. Good. All righty. Well, I am so happy to have you back. And it's funny because the last time in the chat, there was all kinds of Merv is saying this. Merv is thinking this all through.
It was really funny.
Yeah, I think it was from Rachel in the chat. That was very funny the whole day. So
he approves, clearly.
Yes. I remind everybody in the chat to set it to all attendees as well, so everybody can read your fabulous chat. And we have, are you guys drinking any special tea today?
I have peach and raspberry iced tea.
All righty, in a very large mug.
Yes, it is a skull.
Oh, it's a skull. Good.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Beautiful. Perfect. All righty. Mary, how about you? You drinking anything good?
I have my usual Earl Grey tea in a bat mug.
In your bat mug. Awesome.
Yeah.
All righty. Good. I have I'm actually drinking coffee today.
Ooh.
But it is a coffee drink. We're calling it the Amiable Cousin. And it is this, it's coffee. And it's actually an Art in the Age custom coffee blend, which is absolutely delicious. We had it this morning. And but in it is this Art in the Age chicory root vodka.
Ooh.
And a little maple syrup and some half and half. So it's a pure dessert drink that I have, a spiked dessert drink. And it's quite good, and I really love it. And we will put the Brianna, our chat Igor, will put the recipe in the chat here on Zoom. And you can also find it when we post the video on our website. The recipe for it is there as well. And I just the recipe was 2 ounces of the vodka, 1 ounce of the coffee, ½ ounce of maple syrup. You know, I just did what I wanted. I just kept adding whatever until I got the right.
Supposed to work.
Yeah, until I got the right taste. So that's what I'm drinking today in my Narberth Dickens Festival mug too. So there's a great Dickens festival that happens every year. They couldn't do it this year in Narberth, which is near Philadelphia. And it's big outdoor. It's like 2 whole blocks and stores, and they have all kinds of people dress up as Dickens characters. It's a lot of fun. And I missed going to that this year, but I'll drink it out of their mug. All righty. And Victor, I thought, needs a nice warm drink on returning. I mean, he just spent the whole night outside because the gates were closed in Geneva, and he had spent the whole night outside in the storm. So he would need a nice warm drink. And Justine, we know, definitely needs a nice warm drink, the treatment that goes on with her. But thanks to Art in the Age for coming up with this very yummy concoction. I will definitely need a refill later. Luckily, I have my wife and kids watching at home. So when I need a refill, I can say it and somebody will bring me up some coffee. So, but we are not just drinking here today, or I'm not drinking. It's not just me drinking here today. We are also talking about Frankenstein. And what we do every week is dissect, anatomize, dismember, and bring back to life this book by Mary Shelley, chapter by chapter, page by page, word by word, as we create our very own conversational annotation of the entire novel. And in doing this, we at the Rosenbach ask you to support us, which you can do by donation If you're not already a member, you can join the Rosenbach. The basic Rosenbach membership is called the Mary Shelley level. And I'll have more to say about this at the mid-break. And a reminder to people in the Zoom audience now, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many of those as we possibly can today. And the chat, if you're new, is for you guys to have fun amongst yourselves. And the chat's always fun here. We ended the last week with Victor seeing the creature. Well, he sees the creature in lightning, which was a great, reveal. Like the lightning booms and the thunder booms and the lightning in a flash. He sees the creature, and then he goes through another one of his Victor moments where another one of his woe is me Victor moments. No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night. And then he ends that at that little bit by saying about seeing the creature nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. And that the creature is Victor's own spirit let loose. We've already got this in the thing that they're these kind of doppelgangers. They are together, the evil side, the good side, which is which. It could always be debated, but for Victor, at least, the creature is his demonic double, his own vampire. And I wanted to first get your take on that image, the way he uses that. I mean, how gothic that is, that Mary Shelley uses vampire there. And I wanted to get you guys' take on that. And I also want to ask you about Victor as a Byronic hero. But first, this whole vampire and what Victor's talking about here.
Mary, I think you should take the lead on this one because you are the expert in this.
Well, I think you're definitely right that they're doubled, and Victor always seems to put himself first. He is the self, and the creature is the other. And I think that's exactly how he's conceptualizing the creature, with that kind of attachment. And I guess up until this point, the vampire hasn't really been established in novel form yet. Although obviously, as we know, Polidori creates the vampire, which is another thing that comes out of the ghost story session at Lake Geneva, and his vampire is very much based around Byron and the kind of Byronic figure, but the actual like vampire as a kind of supernatural entity that we know them hadn't really been established yet. So I think here it's more of a kind of like loose like metaphor of something supernatural that is feeding on me. There's that attachment there of creator and creation. It's kind of symbiotic, but also Victor frames it as being bad. It's draining the life force out of Victor. The creature is taking life away from Victor, and that's essentially what he's done with William. That's what he goes on to do, and I think that framing is very much done on purpose. And I know I've mentioned, I think it's important to pay attention to who is calling, what names the creature are associated with the creature, and who is calling him those names. And even in this paragraph, we have being, scenes of evil and that I had cast among mankind. So that idea of like being an outcast. And I think earlier on he uses like a couple of paragraphs before, he uses demon. I think you noted the kind of the different ways of spelling demon, D-E-M-O-N and D-A-E-M-O-N. And I don't think there's really any kind of import there, but they are interesting words to note that difference in spelling. And I think some people do like to, D-A-E-M-O-N, Damon. That's how a lot of people like to pronounce it. There isn't a pronunciation difference, and they both do come from the same root word. So it's basically a kind of a Greek word that also we also get later, D-A-I-M-O-N. Which I think it comes into English a lot later. But daemon, basically in kind of Greek, means an entity in between like mortal and the divine. Sometimes malevolent, sometimes benevolent, but not necessarily bad. Whereas demon is kind of almost synonymous with devil. So I don't necessarily think that Shelley is doing anything interesting with like the way that she's using the daemon word, but I just think it's interesting to note that they do share that kind of root, and there is that ambiguity with the daemon and being on that border of the kind of the mortal and the divine. And that's exactly what Victor has done in creating. He has, he's messing with stuff that mortals shouldn't mess with, right? Yeah. And his creation is the product of that. And it's connected to him almost vampirically. But is the creature malevolent or benevolent? I think that daemon spelling maybe leaves it open-ended.
Yeah. Regarding vampire, TPS in the Q&A, would Mary Shelley have read Polidori by the time she wrote this line, meaning his vampire story? And actually, I think not.
I would think not.
It's not published till after this, and he didn't write that vampire story at Villa Diodati. He writes that after he leaves.
She would have been aware of Byron's fragment, his kind of the start that he made to the vampire story in that ghost story session, which Polidori
he doesn't mention vampire or anything, so it's still, it would have been very conjectural. But she had not seen Polidori's story yet. So
just
the way that the way that Victor is treated in this novel, the way she casts him, is very much as a Byronic hero. And we could define that if we went first for some people, but it's interesting that the Byronic hero, which is a kind of hero that Byron himself creates about himself and then comes to be, everybody uses this kind of figure, this haughty overreacher, cynical or ironic, a bit of a bad boy, idealized, attractive, and flawed, all that stuff. And Victor is all of these things kind of, but it's as the people watching this show, my reactions, everybody I know that reads this novel now, almost no one has any sympathy for Victor anymore and sees him as this kind of attractive. He's not an object of sympathy, attractive to a modern audience the way that a Byronic hero usually is, or he was in Byron's poems and other novel. I mean, people love Heathcliff, and Heathcliff's horrible in Wuthering Heights. But first, I'm just wondering, is it because of our modern take on how Victor behaves and what he says, or is Mary Shelley maybe even taking a little bit out of that, kind of figure that Byron has created and other people are starting to use? I know it also connects with the whole Gothic hero villain thing. Yeah. So that's my big intro to let you guys run.
Yeah. So this is something that, falls very much in my wheelhouse. The thing about the Byronic hero is that it is massive patriarchal appropriation. The Byronic hero is much older than Byron. The Byronic hero originates out of a tradition of the rake. So the rake reformed becomes a really popular genre of fiction. So the rake is a archetype of masculinity, and it is an archetype, not a stereotype, that comes up after the Restoration. So you have all of these young men who return to England after the restoration of the monarchy, and they're like, wow, we got kicked out, the king got beheaded, and nothing matters because we're back. We're back in England, we're back in our rightful places, we're back in our manors, we're back in our inheritances. We can do whatever we want, basically. This is where Carpe Diem and the Hellfire Club comes from. So the Hellfire Club really epitomizes this idea. It's these young men who get together and basically are like, God is dead, nothing has consequence, let's literally drink all of our money down the drain. So you have this archetype of young man who basically ruins not only his own life, but his paternal estate by drinking, gambling, dueling, whoring, you know, all of these things. Around about the 1740s and 1750s, this has become a genuine massive problem. Queen Anne tries to outlaw it in the early 1700s. It doesn't work. You get gangs like the Ballers and the Mohawks that roam around London and they're smashing stuff. So sentimental novelists and people that write sensibility like Fanny Burney, like Samuel Richardson, Burney's less interested, start to write these novels about the rake reformed. So it's a former rake who meets a beautiful, you know, pure young woman and becomes obsessed with her and then changes his ways. So the rake reformed becomes a really, really popular trope. And it's still one that we're really into today. Like, we as a cultural society love a reformed bad boy. And it very much comes from this rake reformed because they needed to convince middle-class young women to marry these aristocratic knobheads because they had literally squandered their family fortunes. So all they had was status. So they needed middle-class women with their fortunes to marry these aristocratic young men. Otherwise, the whole of the British hierarchy was going to die, which was probably for the best, but it doesn't happen. When that then becomes the Gothic, you've had all of these women like Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who have fallen for this rake reformed narrative. You then get the Gothic villain, and the Gothic villain is usually the villain. He very rarely is a genuine love interest for the heroine at this point. He's not an anti-hero.
Mm-hmm.
So you have your Manfreds and your Montonis, and they are these brooding, scheming, conniving men. And they're super hot, like they're very attractive, and the heroine has very complicated feelings about them usually, particularly in Radcliffe, but they are explicitly the villain. And the Byronic hero very much is the next stage of this, and he has very little to separate him from this tradition. So when we call him the Byronic hero, really all we're doing is saying he's gone from anti-hero, he's gone from villain to anti-hero. You know, this isn't a new archetype. This is very much something that's been developing for about 60 or 70 years, if not longer by this point. And really what Byron does is make it his thing. So it's not that he creates it, it's that he inhabits it. So we give it the name the Byronic hero. Yeah. The thing about Victor is that he is still the anti-hero. He is not the hero. And he is far more like the villains of the Gothic than he is like the heroes of the late Victorian. As to why we don't have sympathy for Victor, part of that is the way that we market novels. The only reason people love Heathcliff is because we sell Heathcliff as a romance novel. You were never meant to love Heathcliff. Dick, you were explicitly not supposed to love him. That is the whole point of that book. You are supposed to read that book and go, oh my God, you should not love someone like this. That's terrible. And I know we make jokes about Emily and Charlotte Bronte, and then poor Anne, who's writing Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and is like, can't you just like nice men? Like, Anne rejects the Byronic hero. Like, the Tenant of Wildfell Hall is very much rejection of the rake reformed. But we sell Jane Eyre and we sell Wuthering Heights as romance novels. So they feed into this, you know, we sell them alongside Jane Austen. We sell them alongside Elizabeth Gaskell. So we sell them as romance novels. And the reason that we love them is because of the way we package them. Mm-hmm. We package them as this is an attractive thing. We don't package Frankenstein as a role model. We don't package Frankenstein in that way at all. And that allows us to read Frankenstein without pre-existing bias. We know when we pick this book up that it's a monster story, that it's a Gothic story, that it's potentially a horror story. You know, we treat it as sci-fi, we treat it very masculine. You know, a lot of the time we are not thinking about Mary Shelley in the way that and I'm talking very much about materializing the novel and the way that the novel is sold. We do not sell Frankenstein as a women's text, whereas we explicitly as a society sell Wuthering Heights and other Byronic heroes. And that's really where it becomes complicated, because when we're talking about a Byronic hero, what are we actually talking about? Because when women write it and when men write it, is it two different things? And does Mary Shelley complicate that? Really, the answer is no. It's not about who's writing it, because very rarely are we writing it. There's very few examples of the Byronic hero being aspirational or being written for the female gaze. You know, the Byronic hero is not for the female gaze. You get it a little bit with Mr. Rochester, but he has to be physically disfigured for him to become like attractive through the female gaze. So it kind of comes down to how do we view them and how are we marketed them. And Victor is very much at this crux point. You know, this is pre the real celebration of the Byronic hero. And I would personally say that what Shelley is reacting to is the post-Napoleonic re-rise of what led to the rake, because again, you have a culture that has just overcome something horrific, and you have all of these young men who are like, I don't want to, like, the world has explicitly changed, and I don't want to do what my dad says, and I don't want to do, you know, George III is the farmer king. You know, he is this like father of agriculture. The Prince Regent is an absolute waste of space who drinks and eats and hates his wife and is a terrible figurehead. But he's the king. You know, we won the war and now this dude's the king. So again, you have this tradition of young men who are like, well, what's the point of anything? Why should I be a good person? Why should I do these things? Why should I care for my estate? You know, Byron doesn't care for his estate. He lets things go to ruin. He's really not interested. So you again have this tension about young men shirking their responsibilities, and Victor is very much a young man who shirks his responsibilities. He is not interested in his role. So I think when we're talking about the Byronic hero here, it's really important to think about where Shelley is placing this and what, you know, why is she responding to it in this way? And I think you definitely need to think about that 60, 70 years prior to this as to where Frankenstein fits in and why we are so unsympathetic to Victor.
And it's not even just, I mean, I'm certain she's not presenting him in any kind of way that he is a kind of romantic, meaning love interest kind of ideal for people, but he's just not even attractive for anyone as a protagonist. But there are other, like Caleb Williams, but that her father's novel is, I mean, it's clearly designed for, you're supposed to have sympathy for Caleb Williams and his travails. And the same thing with she's reading all the Charles Brockden Brown novels while she's writing this too. And that kind of figure, I think, is so much like the Gothic wanderer kind of
Caleb Williams is an interesting one there, because Caleb Williams is a didactic text. Caleb Williams fits into the Gothic tradition of didacticism. You are supposed to feel sympathy for Caleb, because the same that you are supposed to feel sympathy for the characters in Justified Sinner, for, you know, a lot of the protagonists of short stories in like the New England Gothic, you are supposed to feel sympathy for them because you're meant to relate to them. And by relating to them, you learn. So they are still in that didactic tradition that Radcliffe very much uses, where she presents a heroine who is aspirational but also understandable for the reader so that they can experience through her. You don't need quite as much, you don't need to do the same thing with a male protagonist, because at this time men have more movement. They don't need to experience as much through a character. So you can make them unlikable. You can make a male protagonist flawed. And that is very much what writers like Godwin are doing, where they are kind of critiquing really the male character and constitution and, you know, society, the soul, particularly for Godwin when we think about things like politics and ethics. You know, Godwin is really interested in ethics, but Shelley doesn't need to do that with Victor because you have the creature. you don't need to sympathize with Victor because there are other people in this novel, other beings in this novel that you can sympathize with. And in terms of empathy, the creature is far more empathetic. And what is more effective? Making a horrific monster who is empathetic and you can sympathize with, or having a human, like, it really challenges the reader's perspective, because up until now, everything's been like, oh, but he had such a kind face. His countenance was that of, you know, this and that. And she does this in Valperga because she shows countenance as a young man. It's open and honest and sweet, and it shows his heart. Victor's never gets that. The creature is physically repulsive in many ways, but has a sweetness and an innocence that would usually be ascribed to a hero or heroine. So she can subvert that. She doesn't have to make the didacticism through the main character because she gives you the creature. And I think that's why Victor is so detestable as a character, because he can be. Like, she figures out how, which is incredibly smart of her. She figures out how to make an effective narrative that conveys what she wants it to convey without having to do a relatable or likable hero, so to speak.
Let me throw that over to Mary too about the creature too, because that's then the creature kind of becomes that co-protagonist role in this novel, and then is that where the sympathy for that we are supposed to feel goes to? I just and I harp on this because I really think at the time that she's writing this, I've read very few novels of that time that I did not get the feeling that the author wants me to have sympathy with someone in it. Like that it is an object. It's not anymore, but I think it was once an objective of a novelist that I need you to feel sympathy for somebody in this book, and they would direct you towards who it is or that kind of thing. And so, Mary, where do you fall on this?
Yeah, I mean, brilliant analysis from Mary as always. And exactly, I mean, Caleb Williams is about political injustice and systems and that kind of, you know, the structural relationships between people of the upper class and people of the lower class. It's all about that master-servant relationship and the way that the master, people in the upper class can gain the system and horrible things can happen. And that's why we sympathize with Caleb Williams, because, you know, he is a victim of the system. It's about things as they are, and that's what Godwin was talking about.
And we'll see some of that today with Justine too.
Yeah. And then later, I mean, you talked about Heathcliff. I think the thing about Heathcliff is he is a terrible person, and he's a violent, abusive person. But also at the same time, he can occupy that space of other.
And he's a victim.
Yeah, when he enters the text, he's an orphan. There's lots of readings that you can do of him as a possibly Irish orphan. Some readings that read him as Black in some kinds of ways. And as a child in that space, he's abused and he's not welcomed into that kind of space. You know, on the moors, and part of his kind of he is a victim of that kind of violence and the lack of love that he gets. Whereas Victor, he doesn't have any of that. You know, this isn't about the system. It's about his choices. And he also doesn't have, you know, he has a loving family and they care about him, and he's wealthy. He doesn't want anything financially. He doesn't have any needs. And I think that's why it's so hard to sympathize with him, because why you feel sorry for him when he's just going around.
He intentionally doesn't give him that
exactly.
tragic backstory.
Exactly. There isn't any reason for him to feel sorry for himself. And then the things that he does cause, he's the cause of them. He's the cause of all the problems in the novel, all the bad things that happen to him. But he constantly makes excuses and blames other people. And it's just, you know, the worst, to sum it up. And
like the Byronic hero is usually a soldier or a freedom fighter. You know, Byron's very interested in the idea of fighting for freedom. You know, he gets involved in the wars in Europe. I loathe to give Byron credit for anything. But, you know, most of his characters do have a moral code. You know, like in Don Juan, in Childe Harold, you do have, there is a line and there is a moral. That chivalry still exists. And I think it's really interesting that, you know, what we do actually have in this novel is a character who does value chivalry, and Clerval's presence in the text highlights the fact that Victor completely lacks chivalry. So he's almost not allowed to be a Byronic hero because he doesn't even have, you know, he is, and that's what makes him more like a villain. Gothic villains have an absence of chivalry. That's what makes them a Gothic villain. That is very clearly what makes them a Gothic villain. Usually the Byronic hero, and particularly the modern Byronic hero, has a baseline code of conduct. You know, he will not harm an innocent, and he will not, you know, like take advantage of those who are defenseless. There's usually something that makes him attractive, you know, there's that little spark. Victor lacks that completely, and I think the inclusion of Clerval is very intentional there, because chivalry is a huge thing at this point in time. You know, no one reading this is unaware of how important chivalry is in a young man's education. You know, we're just out of a war. We're also just out of, you know, this period of enlightenment. So,
and it'll become really fetishized through the Victorian age,
very much so. So Victor not having that tragic backstory and not having any chivalry, it basically bars him from hero status. Literally none whatsoever. I mean, Shelley is also a massive critic of chivalry. She basically says it's a load of crap. Like, it's unsustainable, it's based in war, and therefore it's a fallacy. But there is a reason that she puts Clerval in this novel and makes that a point, that he loves those stories and he is chivalric. You know, there's a reason for his inclusion.
All righty. Wonderful. You guys are great. I love having you here. As does our audience. Let's hit the readings for today, the end of chapter 6, and we'll be able to finish today. You know, I'm pretty sure. I'd say that. No, I'm not even gonna try to do that. So we'll finish when we finish. But chapter 6, which we're still in, and we're towards the end, and it's day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were open, so now he can go into the city and the and see his, and go to his family's house. And through this whole first paragraph, I find that, well, he talks in a paragraph how I can't tell anybody that it's like, I think it's the creature that killed my brother, but I can't tell anybody because that would sound like I'm crazy. And yes, it would. You know, I think that's a reasonable explanation for keeping quiet, is that, oh, everybody, I know there's this monster out there that, you know, and nobody's going to believe that. But through this whole first paragraph, we get this back to the names you were mentioning earlier, Mary. It's like the creature's referred to as murderer, my creation, the animal would elude all pursuit. He says, he calls him an animal at one point, and then creature again. And this is something that we've, you know, hit in previous weeks with names for the creature. That I'm always fascinated to see how many, and I did the count. And was that on the show with you guys that I shared that with, or was that?
I think we talked about wretch and how many times wretch was used.
Yeah, wretch wound up being, I did another count, and wretch is 19 times. Fiend actually came out number 1. Fiend is 31 and monster's 30. Now it's mostly because it's Victor referring to the creature, but the creature also calls himself a monster at times, and you know, and the creature calls himself wretch or wretched at some times. So those play into it as well. And when I did my list originally, I didn't include vampire. And who was it? Kim Newman commented on the Facebook group and said, doesn't he call him vampire? I was like, oh my gosh, yes, I have to include it. Or maybe it was David Scahl. No, I think it was David Scahl commented that I have to include vampire in that list. So vampire, good spirit, and man, once each. Go ahead.
Yeah. When you get to, we won't hit it today, but when you do get to the creature's narrative, I think a lot of the words that he uses are a reflection of how he's been treated and his experiences. So I think that yes, like there are a lot of these dehumanizing words in his narrative, but they are very much a kind of, they're reflecting back how he has been treated by society, and you get that here with Victor. And I mean, you know, Victor's like obsessed with how people look, and do people look nice or do they look horrible, and you know, oh, the creature looks really ghastly and ugly and all this kind of stuff. And it's very skin deep. And I think, I think you mentioned it before, but that idea of dehumanizing language, but also the parts that are used, that he uses dead parts, and there's that ambiguity as to whether he uses animal parts as well. And that kind of, he is not human, he's abhuman, superhuman, other. And I just think that's really interesting. And again, you know, with my creation, you have that kind of attachment, that link, that also privileges himself. It's my creation. You have the self and the possessive and the possession there,
which vampire kind of at this point does as well. You know, we don't have the vampire in novels yet, as Mary said, but what we do have is a very explicit connection about vampire lineage, and usually the tales of vampires, so like Stagg's 1810, the vampire, is very explicitly, you know, he's coming for me because we were friends, and there's a very homoerotic subtext there, but the idea that the vampire does not prey on those who were unimportant in life, and that's something that keeps coming up with vampires. You know, Carmilla preys on her own descendants. Lineage and creation is really important when we talk about the vampire as a term in the long 18th century and into the 19th century. So I think that even that use of vampire we can put in that same bracket as creation, because it is explicitly connected in terms of what kind of monster or monstrousness we're talking about.
The vampires of folklore are always preying upon those that they know, their own family, their own community. So
it's usually like, you know, the husband becomes a vampire and then preys upon the wife. And, you know, in Stagg's the Vampire, which is one of the first in English, it's a friend who preys upon his friend, and the guy says to his wife, you know, you need to stop this because otherwise I will come for you. Like, he just knows explicitly before he becomes a vampire that he is going to become a vampire because this is happening, and she will be the victim because she's the closest person to him. So there is very much that kind of chain that, and you know, with the bride and with the idea that this creation won't stop, that is part of what we consider to be vampiric at this point in time.
And we get that specific echo in Byron's Giaour too. In the Giaour, that what a vampire is described, it is the curse of the vampires, that you will prey upon your family and your own daughter, your most beautiful daughter, you will prey on. So, so Byron made that, you know, point 2 years, a year before Frankenstein is written about a vampire. So, at the end of this first paragraph, Victor is, because he cannot reveal this, you know, what's going on, I resolved to remain silent. And boy, we did Dracula last year. We talked about this so much, like people withholding information and how it always dooms them. But this is a Gothic trope in a sense, isn't it? This kind of withholding information and keeping secrets that has an impact on the plot, because then it will wind up hurting people because they didn't know something, right? Is this something from the Gothic, you know?
100%. You know, the idea that there is like a narrative gubbin that means that you can't make it public knowledge. It happens in Dracula, particularly with them not telling Mina. Often the heroine in a Gothic novel feels unable to tell something to somebody, and that's kind of contributes to her being trapped or taken away. Because, you know, he could just say, I made an enemy at school.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and he's killed my brother.
Like, we can do that too. We could find a way,
you know,
to reveal it.
There's that kind of thing where it's like, you could, and this is what kind of makes this one more of a tragedy in the 1818 of his own doing.
Yeah.
It takes it back to that kind of Elizabethan tragedy of the hero has a fatal flaw. Instead, you know, this is like Hamlet playing mad. Instead of rationally and sensibly thinking about a way to frame it, he chooses just to go, well, everyone's going to think I'm crazy and therefore I have nothing that I can do. So this is another one of those instances of Shelley kind of framing the narrative as Victor's doing rather than a divine providence. So it's less a Grecian tragedy and more an Elizabethan tragedy in that sense.
Yeah. All righty. Well, this is going quickly today. I'm actually out of my drink, and it would be great if I could find a way to get some more hot coffee up here.
How could that possibly happen?
Anyway, so now he reminds us again, 6 years had elapsed. Like he's been away from home for 6 years, which has to be, when you're first reading this novel, to be a surprise again. Like, wow, okay, 6 years you've been away. That's such a long time that Victor has, you know, not been there. And he enters the house, and the first thing he talks about on entering the house is, I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece, and it represented Carolyn Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. So, which had to have been changed, right? No, that was still the same for the 1831, but it's Elizabeth's history that's changed. Yeah. But we had a question from somebody, from Bruce, that he sent actually last week. Thank you. Look, I have more coffee. Super wife Kate just brought me more coffee. Bruce asked, the portrait of Victor's mother, Caroline, is described as showing her kneeling next to the coffin of her father. I wondered what Shelley was getting at there. It just seems very weird to me, at least in today's way of thinking, that a family would hang a portrait of a family member next to a coffin. This kind of dramatic mourning pose, and that it's also her mourning for her father. You guys, it is, and it's a strange little detail in this novel, and I wanted to get your take on it while I fix a drink.
I mean, it's strange, and it wasn't fashionable to have mourning paintings at this point in time. That it had been fashionable falls out of fashion. It comes back in fashion, but not until much later than this. But it is memento mori, very much so. So the artistic, you know, remember that you will die. And this comes back in fashion in literature after the Graveyard Poets, so 1750s. And the Graveyard Poets are very concerned, particularly in less so Night Piece on Death by Parnell, but in oh my god, it's just gone from my head. Mary, what's the one that we teach every year?
Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray.
Yes, Gray's Elegy.
Gray's
Elegy
on a Country Churchyard.
I was like, it's not an ode, it's another name of a poem. Gray's Elegy on a Country Churchyard. Gray's Elegy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Say it slowly
Gray's
for people that don't know what it is.
Yes. Gray's Elegy is really concerned with memorialization, and that through the Enlightenment we have come to lack an appreciation for death, and that we do not put enough thought and emotion and feeling into our remembrances. So he's very concerned with things like eulogies and the inscriptions on gravestones. So sensibility does come alongside grief and mourning, and you get this very heavily in Radcliffe's Mystery of Udolpho. You have lots of scenes of mourning in that novel. You have Emily crying over her own mother's grave. You have her father crying over the portrait of his sister. So you do have a lot of instances of remembrance and grief. In Romance of the Forest, you have Adeline read her dead father's narrative manuscript and have a supernatural experience where she experiences it. So death remembrance is becoming more of a thing.
Can I quickly share a painting, because Laura put it in our chat here, and it is a Charles Wilson Peale painting from 1772 of Mrs. Peale lamenting the death of her child, and it's not that a father, but it's a child in this, and it's exactly the kind of thing that you are talking about here. And let me share this. Here it is on the web. It's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And there she is with her child who's died. And we see this again later, usually in the Victorian age, this whole, memorial photography and people taking photographs of the dead. And this becomes a big, thing through the rest of the 19th century. But it's, as you mentioned, this is in the 18th century as well, in painting. And that's what we see in this novel.
Yeah. And it's definitely becoming more of a thing. And it's more about, at this point in time, it's more about the emotions of the living. So whereas later Victorian Memento Mori is very explicitly about death and remembrance, earlier Memento Mori is more about remembering that you will die and valuing life. 18th century Memento Mori is kind of like about grief, and about the experience that death has upon the individual.
It's about Mrs. Peel, this painting, not necessarily a way to remember the child.
The focus of the painting isn't the child. It's the mother who is grieving and the emotion of the mother grieving. This is really important at this point in time. One of the reasons that we suspect Charles III relapsed is because of the death of his daughter. His beloved daughter, I think it's Amelia, is always, whether it's true or not, but it's always imagined to be the cause of his kind of last descent into illness and his longest period of illness. So grief and the effect of grief on the individual, and in Udolpho, Emily's father says, don't indulge too much in grief, it's dangerous. So this is kind of memorializing her father, memorializing her, because look at this sentiment and this sensibility that she, look how beautiful she is in grief and mourning. And it's going back to that Burkean idea of beauty. Yes, it's strange, and also no, it's not, because the focus of the painting is her.
Although it would be interesting, what we don't know is if maybe this portrait was painted after she had died even, and then it was their way of kind of memorializing her in a grieving setting for her father, and also a dramatic setting, which is not unusual for family portraits to be painted in the late 18th century in dramatic settings.
And often then they're in certain costume, and they're imagined in like medieval dress and things like that. I don't know, is there any religious connotations, Mary, or is it mostly just about kind of sentiment and grief?
I think it's exactly that. And I think that, as you're saying, Caroline and her grief is the kind of focal point, but it's also about, Victor's father. If you remember when he's telling the story, he starts the beginning of his tale and it's how my father met my mother. And this is where, he walks into the home of his friend and he sees his friend's daughter mourning over her dead father. That's how Victor's dad meets Caroline.
I met my wife, actually. No, it's not.
But I mean, it's
such a meet cute.
This is a weird meet cute though, right? And it's weird to think I'm going to commission a painting about the first time that I saw my wife, and it's when she was, in such pangs of grief. And whether it was painted, before or after she died, the focal point is still about, this is, and especially when you consider the age gap, which again makes it even more Burkean. That idea that she's a young teen girl,
and he's a grown man
in grief, and he's a grown man,
and I do wonder,
that's the gaze of this picture.
And I wonder if it is critiquing the Burkean beauty, because Wollstonecraft is not a fan of Burke. Like, Wollstonecraft is openly and viciously one of Burke's biggest critics.
That's the Rights of Man, and then rights of
violently against his ideas. And one of the things that Burke says, which I have to kind of
Burke,
like
everyone. So
Edmund Burke. I have to stop myself from tearing the page out every time I get to it. There's a bit in his Sublime and the Beautiful. Don't read it; it's not worth it.
Read the summaries. There you go.
Where he basically says that a woman is at her most beautiful when she is sick or sad, and that a woman who is suffering, who is not fully healthy, is the most beautiful because she's vulnerable. Like a hearty working woman is ugly, and an aristocratic woman who just lays around all the time is also ugly. But a middle class woman who hasn't, got sunburnt skin, but does know the realities of life is the most beautiful. And he basically says, like, women are super hot when they have TB. Like, that's kind of what he says. Like, a woman who
Poe. This is,
yeah,
Poe takes this later. Death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical topic in the world.
And
So.
I think I mentioned this when we were talking about Lucy, that like in Clarissa, when they all come to see Clarissa as she's dying, and it's implied she's becoming almost angelic, she's the most beautiful that she's ever been. And I do think there might be a little like poke here at that Burkean notion of beauty, because, and especially because, Wollstonecraft dies in childbirth and Godwin was obsessed with her. Like he loved her a weird amount, like in a way that, I think for Mary growing up, for Shelley growing up must have been quite strange. And I do wonder if you've got a little bit of this kind of like poking fun at the older generation here, both of those she agrees with and those she doesn't.
Because there's a biographical connection here with this portrait hanging, because the portrait of Mary Wollstonecraft is hanging in the Godwin home her whole life. And we know that, well, I don't know if we know, but I think we assume that Godwin's second wife, Mary Jane Clairmont, really was unhappy that this portrait was hanging there the whole time. So.
I mean, he basically writes this biography of Wollstonecraft where he tries, and it's unclear whether or not he's trying to like reclaim her image, or if he just is so obsessively in love with her that that's actually how he saw her, because he paints this picture of Wollstonecraft in this biography that is very, very different from like everything we know.
If you ever read St. Leon, William Godwin St. Leon, I think you get how obsessed he was with his wife. The kind of the first, I don't know, massive chunk volume of St. Leon is just basically a diatribe of, aren't women amazing, and look at this amazing idyllic family, and look what you can do when you're married, and it's really boring, but and very long and unnecessary, and yeah, it's weird how obsessed Godwin was, and he almost does like a whole 180 with his life, because up until the point that he meets her, he's this massive anarchist, doesn't believe in marriage, all of this stuff, and then through his relationship with her, then he changes a lot of his kind of political philosophies, and you start seeing that in St. Leon, and you definitely see it in the biography that he writes of Mary Wollstonecraft. It's weird.
Oh, I like in this novel that she depicts this in a sense. There's this portrait of the dead mother who is there to remind everybody that, and this is her life. This is Mary Shelley's life, is this kind of coming to grips with, and this both adoration, admiration, and pressure she feels from this, mother goddess figure in her life that was always in a portrait there hanging.
I mean, how can you compete with someone who, according to your father or your depictions of that woman, is so perfect that they're even this beautiful either in mourning or in death? The moments where you are, you would think at your most raw, and she's like impeccably beautiful. And I think considering what Elizabeth says in the next few pages, the pressure of that on Elizabeth is very, very clear to the reader. It doesn't register for Victor. Good. But we are getting to that.
All right. Yeah. And let's I want to get to the meeting the family here, and then we'll take a little mid break, and I want to share something from the Rosenbach with everybody, and then we'll pretty much spend the second half talking about Justine. So but Ernest comes in here. Hey, we get Ernest, and he gets some lines. Even like, I wish you had been here 3 months ago, Victor. We were all happy, which is a little bit of a guilt thing thrown at Victor here, but true. Victor's not been around, and the reader gets a reminder of that Victor should have been around. And then he also talks about how the Victor asks how Elizabeth is, and he says, you know, the death of William has made her very wretched. And there we go, wretched. So take a drink. In the drinking game of wretched, we get a lot of it today. You will be, if you're drinking alcohol, you will get hammered today every time wretched appears in the text. It is like chapter 7 alone is I think there's like 5 or 6 wretch or wretcheds in that chapter alone. But we get it for the first time here. And it's funny because I almost think that if you ask someone, or if someone asks you what's Frankenstein about, you could almost say wretchedness. Like that's not a you know, a completely facetious, you know, idea to throw out there. Like it's a novel about wretchedness and how, you know, strongly she is tied to this, you know, term. 60 sometimes wretch appears in some form in the novel. And we get another shot of it here. So, and now the wretchedness is not just the death of William, but it's also about Justine. So, who we hear has been accused of the murder because she was missing that night. She doesn't have an alibi, and the locket of the mother of Caroline that William had around his neck was found, discovered in her pocket the next day. So, so she was blamed for the murder, and they have, you know, arrested her. The one other note here, it's in this paragraph, this speech calmed me. This is before, is this Elizabeth come in yet? Yeah, the father comes in and Elizabeth hasn't come in yet. We want to talk about Elizabeth's thing, but just before then, there's a moment here where the father is, when Victor says Justine is innocent, and the father is, you know, I hope, you know, she'll be acquitted. And then Victor has, I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine and every human being was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her. There's an addition in the 1831 edition that happens right there, in which he says, my tale was not one to announce publicly. Its astounding horror would be looked upon as madness by the vulgar. He's already hinted at this earlier. But he also says, did anyone indeed exist except I, the creator, who would believe, unless his senses convinced him, in the existence of the living monument of presumption and rash ignorance, which I had let loose upon the world. Now, this is what Mary Shelley adds in the 1831 edition, that part of his sin, part of his problem, his fault, what he has done is he has created this living monument of presumption and rash ignorance. And this is, of course, the name of the first adaptation of Frankenstein, Presumption or the Fate of Frankenstein, which Mary Shelley has seen. And I've always felt a little bit like Mary Shelley was in her 1831 editions, edits to this text, that she herself was influenced by the public perception of the novel and this idea of presumption. And clearly enough, she's even using the word. So it's not absolute evidence, but it still hints at that she is influenced by, this is what this novel is about. But it's also partly the way she's turning this text in 1831 into something else, isn't it?
Yeah. And, you know, I think we said this a little bit last time, you know, she is responding to an increasingly moralistic society. I'm always tentative to say, oh, the Victorians were very moral, or the Victorians were very whatever, because most of what we think about Victorian culture is not particularly the case. But there is a drive towards a more hellfire and brimstone morality, and that's inescapable. We see it everywhere.
And partly for her own good too, right? She needs to convince her father-in-law that she is a moral person and can raise her son. And
yeah,
you know.
yeah, 100%. Like she at this point in time is a woman who has suffered extreme grief. She is trying to maintain herself, maintain a family, not be a victim of the law, essentially. She's an interesting comparison with someone like Charlotte Smith in that way, you know, trying to make their way. And yeah, that by changing this scene and it being more, you know, you still have the arrogance of Victor being like, well, no one's going to believe it because I'm the only one that's smart enough to believe it. But by saying like, the creature is the embodiment of, you know, the Icarus. He is the embodiment of man's folly, of going too close, you know, too close to God, too close to the sun, whatever it may be. The Prometheus. It doesn't explicitly change the message of the novel, because the message of the novel is still the same, but it changes Victor's role, because in the 1818 he doesn't acknowledge that really. He does kind of to Walton, but you have this sense all the way through the main body of the narrative that he is still, you know, he doesn't see himself necessarily as responsible. And when the creature appears later on, he allows himself to believe that it's the creature's fault that the creature has become the way that it is. It's nature, not nurture. So by adding that in, you get more of that kind of explicit Victor is a victim of fate, and a fate that is more heavy-handedly didactic, because, you know, don't be too presumptuous.
Yeah. Good. All right. I want to do a little mid break and then share something, and then we'll hit this description of Elizabeth coming in. I mean, it's I think there's something really in there that we could talk about, and then Justine, obviously. But first, I want to take just a little break to let everyone know that we bring Sundays with Frankenstein to you for free, as we did with Sundays with Dracula last year. So if you'd like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. But why not become a member if you're not already? Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some of our programs. Members also get 10% off any reading courses, of which there are several very cool ones, and 50% off any Rosenbach programs. And did you know that the basic membership level of the Rosenbach is actually called the Mary Shelley level? So it fits in perfectly with the show that we're running right now. So what could be more perfect for you Franken readers to join the Rosenbach at the Mary Shelley level and help us bring the books and manuscripts in our collections to life? I like that copy. I wrote that. It's so much fun doing little puns on Frankenstein, and as we did Dracula last year. But I also want to give a shout out to our new members, people who joined the Rosenbach over the last week, because maybe you guys are watching this show right now. And the people that joined at the Mary Shelley level are Heather in Toledo, Ohio, Jerry in Georgetown, Kentucky, Natalie in Philadelphia, Brenda, who's also associated with the Literally Alive Theater in New York City, and Helen in Kingsport, Tennessee. We're like all over the map here, right? They all joined at the Mary Shelley level. Lynn in Philadelphia joined at the Abigail Adams level, which is even more money. And John in Philadelphia joined at the Phyllis Wheatley level. So if you guys are watching, thank you so much for your support, and to everyone who has joined the Rosenbach or just given a donation, because you're already a member. Your support really helps me make this show and helps us at the Rosenbach continue to create programs and care for our collections. So thank you very much. There's a course coming up that starts tomorrow night. My second series of Read the Blood of Dracula starts tomorrow night, and there's still a few spots left in it. And tomorrow night, we're actually going to talk about the posthumously published short story of Bram Stoker's called Dracula's Guest, which is really derived from what he had cut from the beginning of the novel and didn't use. So we're going to talk about Dracula's Guest tomorrow night. It's very late, you guys. It would be for you guys, but you would be more than welcome to come. So I know you can. It's like midnight or something for you when we do the show. So
we might not be much use.
Yeah, I'm up that late anyway. But Read the Blood of Dracula, the whole course. You can sign up for the whole course, or you can just come to the ones that you want. And we're doing Dracula's Guest, then we're doing Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, and then we're doing Octavia Butler's Fledgling, and then
brilliant.
Elizabeth Kostova's The Historian. So in the second series, I really get to hit some of these great vampire works of the 20th and 21st century. So that'll be fun. So many great virtual courses for you all to enjoy this winter and spring. I was all set to not have a collection share or a manuscript share. And then this morning, I'm sitting over here in my reading chair in the other room, reading Keats, because Tuesday is the 200th anniversary of the death of Keats, John Keats. And there's all these events online, and I've actually signed up for several of them. And it dawned on, and as I'm reading, and we have a letter from Keats in our collection at the Rosenbach, one of his love letters to Fanny Braun. And I thought, oh, and there's all these connections with Keats and the Shelleys and Percy and Mary. And maybe I should mention that on the show today. And then I realized, no, I'll just do the collection share, and I could mention that then. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to share this letter from John Keats, which is in our collection, and it is, let me bring it up here for you all to see. There it is. And this letter is written, it's in 1820. Keats dies on February 23rd, 1821. This letter is from the summer in July of 1820. So it's a few months, and he knows he's going to die at this point. His tuberculosis is really, really bad. He spends many days coughing up blood, and soon he will go to Rome for convalescence, and the hope that he could get a little better, but he knows he has the death sentence of tuberculosis on him. And it is written to Fanny Braun, who he famously was in love with, and there's a whole collection of letters that was published after Keats's death, written to Fanny Braun. He met her during the summer of 1818 when he went home to the north of England to care for his brother Tom, who was suffering from tuberculosis as well. Fanny was 20, Keats was 24. They became secretly engaged, but they never married, because of Keats's his literary ambitions. He couldn't afford to really be married, but also his failing health, because he caught TB from his brother, and he would die just a few months or several months after he writes this letter. And it starts, "My dearest girl." I have the text here too. You guys can look at. I'll make it a little larger, this top part here, and you can. He actually doesn't have difficult handwriting to read at all, which is really nice. It's Wednesday morn, my dearest girl. I have been a walk this morning with a book in my hand, and as usual, I have been occupied with nothing but you. I wish I could say in an agreeable manner, I am tormented day and night, and they talk of my going to Italy, and on and on. And it ends, this letter, with I could show you the ending of it. Here it is. The letter ends at the very end. It says, I guess starting around the sun rises and sets. Is that here? Yeah, the sun rises and sets. The sun rises and sets, the day passes, and you follow the bent of your inclination to a certain extent. You have no conception of the quantity of miserable feeling that passes through me in a day. Be serious. Love is not a plaything. And again, do not write unless you can do it with a crystal conscience. I would sooner die for want of you than, and he leaves that blank, yours forever, J. Keats. And this is a very almost petulant love letter that he writes in the middle part that I didn't read, you guys. He's wallowing in his suffering for Fanny. And when this is often read, this is done by Emily Emily Parker, at the director of education at the Rosenbach. She often reads this letter aloud at a love letters tour, among other love letters that we have. And people have a reaction towards it like, oh, Keats is such a jerk. I mean, he's such a, he's, mansplaining to her about what love is supposed to be and all this kind of stuff. And that is all there. I also give him a little bit of a pass on this. The guy's dying and he's upset by someone else who's also, in love with her. And I always give him a bit of a pass. If you're dying, I give you a pass. So if you want to be a jerk off when you're dying, okay, you're dying, especially when he's dying so young, which is the big tragedy here. I mean, he's 24 or 25 when he dies the next year. I mean, so young. The connection, though, that we can make here today isn't necessarily with content in this letter towards it, although you could say the way he wallows in his suffering is a lot like Victor. But it's just the connection with the Shelleys, that Keats and Percy knew each other and corresponded and talked about each other's work. And they even criticized each other's work, as well, writing back and forth. And there was a respect there as poets that they recognized. Byron actually was snobbishly antagonistic towards Keats, and didn't, and wrote against him and criticized him. But after he died, Byron told was it Murray or somebody, he said, erase anything bad I said about Keats after Keats died so tragically young. Leigh Hunt was also very close to Keats and Percy, and the Hunts and Leigh Hunt and his family were extraordinarily close, and they all were spending time together in Italy. When Keats died, Shelley wrote an elegy for him called Adonais, and it's gorgeous, work of poetry. And it's one of the greatest elegies of the English language. It ranks up there with Milton's Lycidas and Tennyson's In Memoriam. It's gorgeous, piece of poetry that he wrote for Keats. And Mary actually once said, after Percy had died, Mary wrote that Adonais was actually Percy's own elegy for himself that he had written, or at least that's the way she seemed to read it. When she read Adonais, she read Percy writing about his own death, which happens soon, because, well, even before that, another connection here is when Percy and Mary's son William dies. He's only 3 years old and he dies in Italy. He is buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. And when Keats dies 2 years later, he's actually buried very near where William is buried in that same cemetery. So I can imagine the Shelleys actually visiting the grave, as we assume Mary would have done, as she used to do at home, visit her mother's grave. She would have visited the grave of her child, and the grave of Keats was right there as well. When Percy dies the following year, in 1822, in a boating accident. He's out in his boat, and his little sailboat, and a storm hits, and he drowns, and two of his friends drown with him. When Percy's body washes ashore 10 days later, it's kind of not recognizable, but they know that it's Percy Shelley because in his pocket is a copy of the poems of John Keats, Keats's last book of poetry, that we know Shelley had with him on the boating trip. Someone gave him a copy of Keats's last book, and Shelley had it with him to read on his little boating trip. So he had that in his pocket. And when Percy is cremated on the beach there, because they're not going to allow the body into town, it's quarantined because it's a decaying body, so they cremate it on the beach, and Byron's there, and Leigh Hunt's there, and some others. Mary's not there at the cremation of her husband, but the others are there. And as they're cremating the body, is a story you guys know, I'm sure a lot of people know, as they're cremating the body, Edward Trelawney, who's there, reaches in and pulls out the heart as the body's burning. He burns his hand badly, and he takes the heart out, and afterwards he gives it to Mary. But there's a little bit of battle in the letter. Some people think in their letters back and forth to each other that I should have the heart of Shelley. I was closer to him, and they argue a little bit about it. But Mary gets the letter, but it kind of disappears from history for a few decades until Mary dies. And then they open the drawers of her desk, and it is found in one of those desk drawers, and she has stored it, wrapped it in leaves of a copy of Adonais. That is how she kept it. And by this time it just kind of crumbled to dust, but that's where she kept it in this. And then it was later buried with her son, actually, when their oldest son, Percy Jr., who lived, a longer life, eventually died. Percy's, his father's heart was buried with him. So Keats has got lots of connections with the Shelleys, and not including that Mary, the heart of Percy, of Mary's husband, was actually kept in the copy of the poem that, not the manuscript copy, but a printed copy of Adonais that Percy had written for Keats. So I just thought, how could I miss this opportunity to share this just as we're nearing the 200th anniversary of the death of Keats. So that's our little collection share for today. Do you guys read much Keats or like Keats, enjoy Keats at all?
Keats is my I hesitate to say favorite of the romantics because I don't like most of them. But I find Keats's poetry to be the most endearing, and I think Keats's story is there's a really beautiful film called Bright Star, that if any of you are interested in the relationship between Fanny and Keats, is a really, really beautiful film, and I would highly recommend it. As a
Bright
kind
Star.
of like Regency specialist, it's one of the few, it hits that fashion point really well, and the cast is fantastic. Yeah, Keats I like. I do find him to be quite petulant, but in a way that is quite endearing. Like, that letter reminds me so much of Radcliffe's Valancourt, where he's like, Emily, you can't, I'm in so much pain. Like, I'm in so much pain because I love you. It doesn't spare a thought for the fact that she might also be in pain. She's been through this great tragedy. And I see very much of, and Keats loved Radcliffe. Keats had, I think Keats is less, I don't want to say pretentious because a lot of the romantics are, but I think that's a bit of a generalization too. But there's something very sweet about a lot of Keats. And he's the only one whose work I actually own for myself and not for an academic,
good.
as an academic reason.
Well, when we get you to Philadelphia one day, we'll put this letter in your hands so
Yes.
you can see this letter from Keats to Fanny. So, you like Keats, Mary?
Yeah. His poetry is really beautiful. I agree with Lauren. I think of a lot of the romantics, they're just a bit of a nightmare, aren't they? I do like P.B. Shelley, but I think just more because his poetry is interesting as opposed to, I would read this for pleasure. Yeah. Whereas I think with Keats,
and
I think
Wordsworth, I feel like is not for me. Coleridge is great.
Yes.
Blake is also really great. I love Blake, but there's
Blake's
something
like
about
a special
Keats,
exception.
Yeah. I mean, Blake's outside of them all in a sense, but but Keats for me too, even of the second generation, Keats seems to be outside of everyone else.
I think that's why I like Keats so much. He's almost his own entity. He reminds me kind of maybe someone like Cowper. Like, there's something about Keats. There's a real realness. He's not as privileged as the others. He's not really part of that intellectual set in the same way. I mean, there's a reason that Byron is so snobby about Keats. And Keats can be, there, like you see it in that letter, he can be like, woe is me. But there's a sort of, there's just a something about Keats's poetry that is just really beautiful to read. And like Mary, I love PBS because he's ridiculous. And we affectionately call him Bish Please. But yeah, PB is fascinating, and I like to read his poetry in the same way I like to read trashy novels. That kind of interest, but Keats is the one that, if I had to pick like a favorite poem of the period or something, it would probably be a Keats poem. And I have a really beautiful edition of his.
I certainly don't mind Keats being, kind of, woe is me, when the guy spends half his day spitting up blood for the last couple of years of his life. I'm like, dude, you're allowed. So
he gets a pass.
He gets a pass. And he is so young, he is so young, and he catches it by going to care for his brother, and his younger brother is again like this like beautiful soul who's lost early, and the whole relationship with Fanny, and it's just a really kind of, it's a really beautiful story, which is why I really enjoyed Bright Star. I would highly recommend it.
Great movie.
It is sad, but it's also just it's a very enjoyable film. It's very aesthetically pleasing, and it's got a really beautiful pace to it.
All right. We had a couple questions here, and I'm going to refer to a couple of them to later anyway, because Janet asked about the Victor and the creature dyad fit the definition of doppelgangers. I think it does, but that's also something I'd rather talk about later when we get later chapters, when we get the Victor and creature together. Maybe even next week I'll talk about that. Linda asked, why wasn't the servant who found the locket in Justine's pocket a suspect? We could maybe hit that a little bit as we talk about that today when we hit the trial in a few minutes. And Emma asks, can we send questions or opinions about the book as emails? Yes, please do. Email me at epettit, E-P-E-T-T-I-T at rosenbach.org. Always send me a question. I'd be happy to take them. That's how I get them sometimes and do them. So please send me questions via email. And back to the chapter, the very end of chapter 6, Elizabeth comes in. We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had made great alterations to her form since I had last beheld her. Yes, 6 years has gone by. She has gone from being, a child. I'm not even sure she's a teenager when he leaves. And now she is, a woman in stature and expression of countenance, which was uncommonly lovely. And then there's this whole description about her, about my dear cousin, as she says to Victor. What do you guys make of the way she is portrayed coming into this scene? And I think we really get we get both a physical description about her beauty, but also this phrenological description of her open and capacious forehead. What do you guys make of this, the way Elizabeth comes in? And this, we've had a description of her child and her who she is and how she gets to this family, but this is the first time we really get a physical description, or a strong, or maybe I guess it's the adult one. So what do you guys think of this?
It's kind of
lacking, it's lacking emotion, isn't it? Like there's no emotion here. It's just kind of like, oh, you've changed, I guess. Like, I guess you're physically beautiful. You look kind of sad and you're older, but like there's nothing really there. Like there's nothing of that, in the Keats letter of, I've missed you or I've loved you. It's just immediately, okay, cool. You're a bit older, a bit sadder, and here's just a generic description of you physically.
If you fed every description of a heroine from say 1750 to 1800 to a bot and then told it to make one, this is what it would come up with, even down to the description of her forehead. Like she got great forehead, like, okay, fine. But because what Victor is actually doing here is ticking the boxes. A woman of character is supposed to have a certain face, a certain posture, and a certain countenance. And he basically just goes, yes, she had great form and was uncommonly lovely, and her face was good. Like there's nothing there. There's nothing original. There's nothing unique. He is aware of the fact that she, is maybe quite exceptional. He doesn't actually understand or care what makes her exceptional. And when you compare, you might not pick it up first time you read this novel, but when you start to read more Shelley, and particularly when you read later Shelley and you read things like The Last Man or Valperga, which, as I said before, has two really standout female characters, the description that a character like Euthanasia gets versus a character like Elizabeth, and they're very similar characters, and I would potentially even go so far as to say an extension of the same thought experiment that Shelley is doing. this I would be offended if I was Elizabeth and Victor wrote this about me. I would be really offended. It is so basic. Like it's really unimaginative. As Mary said, like it's basically if you made a heroin bot, this is what it would come up with. Poor Elizabeth.
Yes, and she also feels wretched, as she says here. So if you're playing the game at home, drink during wretched. That that big and she's wretched because Justine has been accused of this, and they think that maybe she has done it. The father actually says he's going to rely on the justice of our judges. That if she's innocent, she will be released, and which is I mean, I would think too that for him to rely on the justice system of this kind of enlightened Republic of Geneva, for Mary writing this chapter is clearly her critiquing this romantic view of what we can shape our republics into, and the justice will be fair because we have
and
judges.
Heavy class critique. Like William is the child of a respected gentry family, and Justine is a servant. And what is really key here is that Elizabeth's insistence on Justine's innocence means nothing to anybody. And we see this in the trial scenes. And I know I always mention this, but Dr. Kathleen Hudson, her book on Gothic and the Servants from University of Wales Press, Kathleen does really fantastic work about Justine. And for those of you interested in kind of long-term Gothic connections, has done a really good paper. I don't know if she's published it yet, but ask her about it on Twitter. Did a really fantastic paper recently connecting Justine to Blade Runner 2049 and the AI character in that film, and talking about
I think she mentions that in her book.
I think she does, doesn't she?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the later chapters, but she has a section on Frankenstein and servant narratives and kind of adaptations, and she looks at specifically the Justine character, as well as the creature.
What's that book called again?
It's called Gothic Servants.
Gothic Servants. Good.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
Kathleen Hudson, her work's great, but yeah, she touches on the kind of play adaptations, but then also like some of the more recent like film adaptations. So she talks about Kenneth Branagh's film version, where obviously the head of Elizabeth is put on the body of Justine. I think is that way around,
something like that.
But even Justine's death in that movie is shocking, horrible, and also hilarious. Like it's this weird, almost Monty Python moment when they rush her out and she's, hung and in this shocking way that can't help it. I remember seeing it for the first time in the theaters long ago when it was released, because I'm not old. And it kind of elicits laughs. Everybody's like, ah, because it looks almost like a Monty Python moment.
Yeah, it's the wrong type of Gothic camp.
Yeah,
which is
Justine is always done wrong, whether it's at the hands of Kenneth Branagh or at the hands of the justice system.
Well, let's look at her here now, because the chapter start and we get now it's the wretched mockery of justice. So wretched again here in the chapter. And this kind of criticism of the justice system that happens, but then Justine comes in. And what would one of you read this appearance of Justine chapter here, or paragraph here? Chapter. Yeah, read the whole chapter. We'll just sit back. That'd be fun for me.
Do you want me to do it, or do you want to do it?
You can go.
Okay. Do you want, so starting at the appearance of Justine?
Yeah.
Okay. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered by the solemnity of her feelings exquisitely beautiful. Yet she appeared confident in innocence and did not tremble, although gazed on and execrated by thousands. For all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have excited was obliterated in the minds of the spectators by the imagination of the enormity she was supposed to have committed. She was tranquil, yet her tranquillity was evidently constrained, and as her confusion had been adduced as proof of her guilt, she worked up her mind to an appearance of courage. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes round it and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered herself, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest her utter guiltlessness.
Yeah. What do you make of this? And especially as the way we get this description of Justine, and as the way we've had the description of Elizabeth coming in at the end of the last chapter.
What I would like to point out here is that this is hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is really crucial because Victor feels guilt for what happens with Elizabeth later. No spoilers, but for what happens later with Elizabeth. But he is more acutely aware of the fact that he could have prevented what happens with Justine. I think. And I think that it's really telling in the way that he describes Justine in this moment.
Dressed in mourning.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's for William, obviously.
Yeah, but you know, that she is so, this description of Justine is so much more memorable than the one of Elizabeth, and it's so much more unique than the one of Elizabeth. And part of it is the foreshadowing. And a reader in 1818 would be fully aware of the reaction that somebody who had been accused of child murder would be getting. I used to work in a crime and punishment museum. The 18th century justice system and the 19th century justice system is far more brutal than we perhaps think of it being. You know, we still have public hangings, and public hangings were a fun day out. You know, you took your family and they sold cakes and beer and pies. And one of the only reasons that they banned public hangings is because people got crushed to death because the crowds were too big.
Yeah.
So this is a sensation. And I think part of this is narrative construction on Shelley's part, because the fact that she is so tranquil because she knows she's innocent, we know that this is going to lead to her death. You know, we already know that this is coming, and this is that kind of foreshadowing moment. But yeah, I think when you remind yourself that this is him telling the story years down the line to somebody, it takes on a slightly different appearance. And I think there's a lot of kind of guilt and knowing wrapped up in that.
And it's all, but even with the description, and she's only going to last for this chapter, but I almost get the feeling like, and here comes Justine, and it's like, move over, Elizabeth. I'll show you what a real heroine in this kind of novel is. And here she is, and she's so strong in this novel, in this chapter, that it really makes me want to have the Justine novel.
And it contributes to Elizabeth being erased, because Elizabeth is desperately trying to save Justine. She is telling everyone who will listen that Justine is innocent. And the horrible thing here for Elizabeth is that she can't save Justine. And from a servant mistress narrative perspective, this is horrifying, because Justine is Elizabeth's maid, essentially. She is Elizabeth's like favorite, and for Elizabeth, probably the closest thing that she has to a friend. And this is a really like sacred relationship at this point in time, the relationship between like a genteel woman and her lady's maid. So what we get is Justine through Victor's eyes, through his guilt at the creature and the creation, and the fact that he's keeping it secret. Elizabeth's knowing that she's innocent and being able to not save her, and being able, you know, that's all completely erased. It's not important to Victor at this point in time. Elizabeth's not an important part of this story at this point in time to him, and it almost contributes to the erasure of the heroine. Justine becomes Victor's tragic turning point, rather than the first, you know, the death of William and Elizabeth's guilt at the death of William. Like, this for Elizabeth is the moment that her tragedy begins, and it's just swept over. You know, it's all about, oh, look how wonderful Justine was, and I could have saved her and I didn't save her.
let me ask Mary to chime in on this part of it too. That Justine is there's a lot of parallels with her and the creature as well, right? I mean, abandoned by society. Later in this chapter, she is called an amiable, or she calls herself, I can't remember, an amiable creature, or they refer to her as that. What do you think of the connections? And because this is why I think Justine's so important in this novel, is that she is like another creature in the novel.
I mean, absolutely. And we were talking about doubling earlier, and I think that you do get that with Elizabeth and Justine, and also with Justine and the creature, and the way that Justine and the creature are helpless, and also the way that Elizabeth and Justine are similar in so many ways, but also so different. And I think what's interesting with Justine is that the difference is really one of class. Justine is abandoned by her parents. Elizabeth also, abandoned by her parents. They both end up in the Frankenstein house, and they say quite late on, "Oh, you remember Justine? Our favorite friend.
Yeah.
She's one of the family." But she isn't.
Mm-hmm.
She's a servant, and therefore, she's not in those kind of opening chapters of Victor's recollections. He mentions Clerval, his friend, but he doesn't seem to mention Justine, who was there, because she's a servant. And it actually, this bit already, it reminded me recently of, we're in a pandemic, and I just remember like the I don't know if you remember this, Lauren, but in the first wave, like the first lockdown, where you had all these people clamoring to get their cleaners and their nannies and their au pairs back to work, and saying they're part of the family. Of course they want to work. We love them. They're one of us. And what you didn't really hear was the perspectives of, the cleaners or the people who work in childcare, or the au pairs who are probably like, you're actually my employer. Yeah. We don't have that kind of relationship. We like you, but I don't want to endanger myself. And that familial relationship being important, and maybe seen in a different way depending on where you are in that class scale. And just another thing as well, because this really reminded me of Knives Out.
I was just about to say that. Because, just about to be like, oh my god, we should talk about Knives Out.
Yeah.
Why are we
so Knives Out is a fabulous,
good,
fabulous kind of class deconstruction of kind of in America of the migrant especially, and also that kind of the help, where everyone in that family says, oh, Marta, she's one of us, I voted to have you at the funeral. And yet obviously they didn't want them at the funeral, because she's not one of them. And when it turns out that she inherited all that money, they all turn on her because she's not one of them. And I think both Justine and Marta are framed for murder, and the differences are here. Justine's case is that it exposes the flaws of that system, because they are weighted for the privileged, and Victor's dad and Elizabeth can't see the justice system through the eyes of someone who is of a lower class, because they have that privilege. They cannot imagine that the justice system would unfairly convict someone through circumstantial evidence. And obviously later you get the confession, but even here in this moment, everyone thinks she's guilty. Everyone's prejudged. And that's the system that's the justice system.
And it massively critiques the class as well, because Elizabeth is worried, Elizabeth, because she's kind of on that boundary where she is privileged, but she's still kind of other because she's got no like proper family. She's kind of like, this is going to go wrong. I feel like this is going to go wrong. Victor's dad is like, oh, it'd be fine. But we know, had it been Elizabeth that was accused, there would be no trial.
Yeah.
He would have used his privilege and his money. But Elizabeth's word isn't good enough, just as Justine's word. So there's a gender criticism here, but there's also a massive class one. But yeah, I was just about to say, rewatching Knives Out, post-pandemic, I was like, oh.
I haven't seen that yet. I have to
Oh,
watch that. Yeah.
It's really
so
great.
Yeah, my kids
It's-
watched. I think my wife
yeah.
watched it. I didn't get to see it yet. So Christopher Plummer's in it,
fantastic.
right? Oh, is he like
It's
the
like his
patriarch
like
of the family,
last
right?
role.
Yeah,
And Daniel Craig does an
yeah.
intentionally terrible Southern accent, and it's just brilliant. Yeah, it's a really, really like scathing
You're talking about
critique.
the class distinctions here between Justine and Elizabeth, and it's interesting because for the 1831 version of this novel,
Okay.
Elizabeth is just some poor orphan kid
Mhm.
that the Frankensteins have adopted.
Mhm.
But Justine, this poor orphan kid from that they've not adopted, and how they will be treated so differently if you're only reading the 1831 edition.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And I think
it's
that
even more
like
stark. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's kind of where by 1831 we are edging towards a more clearly divided society, as we move away from the agricultural system where it's easier to sell yourself this lie that the tenant farmers are part of the family, and you have all these narratives about good, Mr. Knightley in Austen's Emma is a great example of this. You have all these characters who are good landlords and good this, and the poor are poor, but they're they've got people like Emma Woodhouse going to visit them. As you get into the industrial period, that obviously becomes a more obvious divide and less easy to say, well, these people deserve it and these people don't. And obviously that's where you get people like Dickens coming in. And I think that distinction in 1831, yes, it's partially because she changes the cousin thing, and adds that kind of fate thing, but also it makes the difference between Elizabeth and Justine so much more arbitrary, and so much more painful, because there is no difference apart from the fact that Victor's father chooses one of them and doesn't choose the other. That's almost all it is.
I think it's also important this scene too that it's a trial scene. We actually get 4 courtroom scenes in this novel. Nobody talks about Frankenstein as a courtroom novel, but there's actually 4 courtroom scenes in the novel.
There is a really good Sue Chaplin, Gothic and the Law. If you are interested in the way that the law and justice figures in the Gothic, there has been good work done on it.
Good,
but yeah. Otherwise, no one talks about it.
I know, because it happens in this novel, and this is the courtroom scene, and then she's she declares her innocence, and she's so helpless, at the hands of these men not just the men running the court, but the people as well, because even when Elizabeth thinks that I'm going to help her by telling everyone how devoted we are to her and how close she is with the family, they take that as further evidence of her, being a terrible person, that she would still kill William, even though she treated him like a mother. So that's the class distinction that you're talking about, coming in there.
And also because aristocratic mothers don't kill their children.
Yeah.
Poor mothers kill their children. There's a lot of really complex stuff going on in this point in time about class and murder, and this narrative starts to come up about poor women who are child killers, who kill their children, and it's kind of like increasingly a divide, and you have cases where a child's fallen down the stairs or died of illness, and a mother is put on trial and hung for child murder, and they're always poor women. So I would hesitate to say for certain that there's something here, because I would need to do the research, but I know just from my time in the Justice Museum that this is definitely something that is an issue, increasingly so at this point in time.
Well, she could. They go through the trial here, and then after they're back home, they discover that. Then we get some more wretcheds and wretchednesses in here, but then they find out she has confessed, and Elizabeth is crushed by this. That Justine has confessed, and they can't believe this. So they go visit her. And Elizabeth says, "Oh, Justine, why did you rob me of my last consolation? Although I was then very wretched." We get more wretched. So Justine's reason here is, Mary, do you have this I did confess paragraph here?
Yeah.
Could you read that little paragraph? Especially because then we'll get religion here too. So
yeah, of course. I did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution. But now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than all my other sins, the God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretch doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour, I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable.
feel free.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the other thing that is different about Justine, is that she is a Catholic, and part of her faith, part of Roman Catholicism is the importance of confession and the priest, and also that I guess the threat of eternal damnation. You do get this in Anglicanism and Puritanism and Calvinism, but I guess to a lesser extent, the kind of the massive kind of focus on hellfire, and you will be eternally damned, and you will be in hell, and the fire and brimstones, all this kind of stuff. It's a massive part of often religious trauma that's associated. I mean, you get this in all religions, but specifically Catholicism. There's a lot of even now people that express the kind of PTSD that they have from these stories that will have been drilled into your head from childhood, that if you do bad things, you are going to hell and you are going to suffer eternal torment. And I mean, if you imagine, especially like Catholic religious spaces that are filled with artwork and Catholic artworks and stained glass windows and all this stuff that often focalizes on this, the fire and brimstone. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, Catholic guilt has become a kind of thing that a lot of
it's a TV
trope or ex-Catholics talk about. And it's, the whole point of confession is you go often weekly and you confess your sins, you confess everything. The idea that you have things that you have done wrong that you need to confess. And here what you have
as a child, you go through this, and I had to go through the process of like, well, first of all, I'm not going to tell you some of the stuff I really did. So then you have to make up little things, and then you wind up double sinning every time I would go.
Right. And then imagine if someone thinks that you've done something really, really bad, and then every time that you see them, they're trying to get you to confess to this thing that you haven't done. That's a kind of torture. And that's essentially what Justine has experienced. She has this authority figure, this religious authority figure who's threatening her. It's a threat. If you don't confess, you are going to hell. And the power that this kind of priest would assume in that role, in that authoritative role, I can send you to hell. That's essentially what he's been saying to her. And she's just lost a family friend, and now she's been accused of murder, and now she's got all of these, I guess, conjurations of all of her life of this Catholic, these images that have been painted to her, and they're all brought up to her in this kind of state of this frenzied state that she's in, and so she confesses because she's been led to believe, if she confesses, then I will get absolution. And absolution is the forgiveness of your sins, which then will allow you, as a Catholic, salvation. I will no longer be going to hell, I will be going to heaven. and there I will get peace and, you know, the kind of eternal life that I want. But obviously the problem with that is that, and I think, you know, why it is such a kind of torture and abuse of power in a way to force that confession, because obviously now everyone thinks that she's damned anyway because she's a murderer. And also now she's just signed her own death sentence, and it's going to be a very violent death. And that violence, it's not something that may happen in an afterlife. It's something that is going to happen, and it is going to happen now, in the here and now.
Which is very reminiscent of something like the Inquisition, which figures heavily in the Gothic, and something that Shelley later becomes very interested in. The Spanish Inquisition features heavily in Valperga, and in Valperga you have a character who is kind of an echo of Justine. She I think her name's Bianca, but she is a priestess. She's literally a holy maiden. She believes that she is like a prophetess, essentially, of this like sect. She is found by the Inquisition, and when she comes out of the Inquisition, she's basically traumatized. She's broken, and she's so broken that she believes actually there's a spirit of evil, and it's all a lie, and there is no God whatsoever, you know, and she's really broken by it, and eventually it is essentially what kills her. So this idea of like religious trauma seems to be something that Shelley comes to again and again. Mary, I've just seen someone ask if there's a book about Gothic and priests. And my answer is yes, many, but you probably know which ones to recommend. I
mean, there's so many books. There's lots of books on specifically Gothic and Catholicism. So Diane Hoovler has a lot. The Gothic ideology. I think she has another one, and I forget what it is. But Maria Purvey has a book on Gothic and Protestantism, which is really good. I really like her work.
Her stuff is really good.
Feel free to send me some too, or we could post them on the Facebook.
My first thoughts were Alison Milbank.
Alison Milbank has some really great work on God and theology in 19th century. And her latest book is really good.
Does Marie Mulvey Roberts talk about it? Marie Mulvey Roberts is a fantastic Gothic scholar. Saw her give a keynote on Frankenstein. That is one of the best keynotes I've ever been to, and would highly recommend her work.
I mean, I will say, if you're pretty much guaranteed, if you pick up any book about the Gothic, especially ones that are kind of like about the Gothic, maybe of any particular time period, but especially of this kind of early Gothic or romantic Gothic, there will be a chapter on
unavoidable
anti-Catholicism or Catholicism and the Gothic. Maria Purvey's book is great because she looks at specifically Protestantism, which is really interesting. But pretty much every book that you find will talk about it. Maria Mulvey Roberts, just for anyone who is interested, who is the person who gave the keynote, the Frankenstein keynote, her work on Frankenstein is great. She has a really great book, just because I remember this from the other week that we were on, called The Gothic Immortals, which talks about alchemy and St. Leon and all of that kind of stuff, and I think Frankenstein as well. Her work is great.
Good. That's the one I want to read.
Her most recent one, she talked about like constructions, and she talks about like modern art, and she talks about Frankenstein. I will, as we're going on, I'll look up the title of it, but she's one of my favorite scholars.
All right, I'm going to get to the rest of the chapter, but I also want to hit this question from Anastasia, one of our co-hosts, says that I think you mentioned a parallel between Elizabeth and Justine. Might we also see a parallel between Justine and the creature? Both are wretches, wronged and mistreated. We want to talk about that for just a minute before we hit the end of this chapter.
And I think you get this a lot more when you get to the creature's narrative. When he
this is like you hear what Justine says. Keep this in mind later when we get to the creature.
And here, I mean, he talks about a kind of hesitancy in, I mean, spoiler, he plants the the picture in Justine slightly different in different editions. But there's that moment of hesitancy where he kind of looks at her and sees her and then decides to do it. But yeah, I mean, they're essentially, they're both victims of Victor, which I think is interesting. You know, Victor, through his inaction, causes harm on both of them. And throughout this whole trial scene, we are sat with Victor because it's his story, he's telling it. We're sat with him, knowing that he knows she is innocent and watching him do nothing. And I think this is a really big indictment on him and why he is the worst. Because, you know, he knows he could do something. He could get up just as Elizabeth did and give testimony. Or there's lots of things that he could do here that he doesn't do. And it's the same with the creature. He just completely abdicates, you know, all of his responsibility.
And we have this whole scene between Elizabeth and Justine talking here, and then Victor's obviously here, and then we realize Victor's standing in the corner.
Just in the corner. He's just having another woe is me moment, because for him, the thing about the trial scene is that it's the worst for him. And he says this multiple times.
Yeah.
It wasn't as bad for her because she knows she was guilty, but I also know this stuff, but it's, you know, it's worse for me because I know who did it. And it's weird. I mean, yeah.
He even says the poor victim, Justine, he thinks, the poor victim, Justine, who on the morrow was to pass the dreary boundary between life and death, felt not as I did, such deep and bitter agony. Like, my agony is worse than hers, and she's about to be executed.
And that's not the first time, I think, in this trial sequence that he says something like that, where he focuses on his own torment. And, you know, I gnashed my teeth and ground them together, and I uttered a groan that came from my utmost soul. And it's like, dude, you're like, Justine is gonna get killed, and he's made up this whole excuse like, oh, I can't tell anyone because they'd think I was mad. He could make up something.
He's allowed himself to believe that it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
And this is a really common trope in this kind of like gothic anti-hero, and I kind of clearly call it the Hamlet trope. You know, he goes, oh well, this was unavoidable, but it's my shame. I've caused this, but there's nothing I could have done about it, and I was trapped here. And it's like, actually, no, you weren't. You could have done something about it, but it's more. It paints you more as the tragic hero in your own narrative to frame it like that. And again, this is him painting his narrative to Walton.
Yeah.
You know, he's saying to Walton, gosh, wasn't I wretched because I'd done this thing and there was nothing I could do to save Justine, when actually he is Victor Frankenstein. And if he'd have walked in and said, I believe that she is innocent, and I think it's this person who did it, you're never going to be able to catch him, but she's my servant in my house, it was my brother, and she's innocent, they would go, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But he chooses not to.
There's a massive difference as well. Like, Elizabeth thinks that Justine is innocent. She doesn't know it really, but she trusts her friend, and she trusts the character. Whereas Victor knows that she's innocent. But if he didn't have that knowledge, and if you remove all of that, if you remove the creature from this, and he'd just gone back home and like, oh, my brother was murdered and all this circumstantial evidence, would his reaction be the same? Would he still have that kind of same trust that Elizabeth has? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the difference between the two, and why his inaction is the worst.
He's silent. And Mary Shelley really intensifies his silence too, in that she even has the women speak in court, which you never find in early, and it's in reality too. Women don't have a voice in court, and not only does Justine get to testify on her own behalf, but Elizabeth does as well, and it's ineffectual. So you're really called to that attention that we're not listening to the women, and the man here in this situation who could do something chooses to be silent.
Is something that Shelley comes back to again and again and again. Yeah. Shelley gives voices to women in situations where in reality they are voiceless, and it's always ineffective.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly painful actually to read it, that what she is doing is reminding you again and again and again that the voiceless, even when voiced, are still treated as such, that it's not that we can't hear them, it's that we choose not to, essentially. And it's a really poignant message that she continues throughout her fiction, and kind of comes back to repeatedly.
Victor, we get Paradise Lost pulled in again, which I don't want to pass over, even though we're going a little long. That I, the true murderer, felt the never dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope or consolation. This is towards the very end of the chapter. And then he says, I bore a hell within me, which nothing could extinguish. Actually, that extinguish, Mary had written diminish in her manuscript, and Percy changed it to extinguish. And I think that's like a good moment, like a moment where, yes, you extinguish this fiery hell, you don't diminish it. But what I found really interesting is going through this is that Percy frequently in his editions, it seems that his most frequent editions are about Richter and the creature. And in these chapters here about Elizabeth and Justine, almost nothing. He doesn't have anything to say, like anything to add to what they're saying. And I find that very interesting.
I mean, in one way, I'm like, good, because what right do you have to add anything to their speech, Percy? But in another way, I'm like, yes, shocked that you had nothing to say about this, PV.
So, and that's the evidence of the manuscript text. It doesn't add to that. But this "I bore a hell within me" is clearly a reference to Paradise Lost. And Lucifer, as he's approaching Eden, Milton writes, horror and doubt distract his troubled thoughts, and from the bottom stir the hell within him. For within him hell he brings, and round about him, nor from hell one step no more than from himself can fly by change of place. So that hell that Satan carries within him is also all around him, and he can't move away from it because it's within him. And Victor feels this about himself, and absolutely has to tell Walton and us that he has the hell within him. But it's also the Paradise Lost, which will really come in, especially next week when we finally get the creature in, and Paradise Lost becomes a central echo in this novel.
It's interesting too that then you have the lines when Elizabeth says, I wish, cried she, that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery.
Yeah.
And Justine assumes the air of cheerfulness and embraces Elizabeth. And you get that sense here that though there is the class discrepancy, Elizabeth and Justine's affection for one another is very real. And that again is kind of like passed over. And I think I think I talked last time about what isn't in the text and the absence, and that statement from Elizabeth, who is trying her best to be supportive for Justine, that she can't not say that she is genuinely so distressed by what's happening that she almost wishes she could go with her, because it's going to be more painful. Like, she's the one that has to live on, and we got that idea of grief coming back again, and the grief of having to live with this. That kind of, he's like, it was like a cloud that passes over the fair moon but can't hide its true, it's a weird statement to make, but that moment there when Elizabeth says that to Justine hints at something so powerful between these two women, and we never get to see it. And when we talked previously about Elizabeth and Elizabeth's role in that text, there's something huge here. There's something really significant, and we don't get it because Victor's not interested. And I think that is a really striking absence, that this is so painfully tragic because Elizabeth is so devoted to this girl and vice versa, that they are trying to be strong for each other and failing, and that, they can't protect each other and they can't be there for each other. But it's not important. What's important is that Victor feels like Lucifer. You know, what's important is that he's committed this terrible sin and the fire of hell is within him. And Elizabeth is like, my whole life has just been ruined. He's like,
And how appropriate that
get
he's
that
picking
kind of-
Lucifer. He's picking, you know, that figure who is all about, you know, that selfish, you know, hubris that Lucifer has in that poem. I mean, Milton doesn't mean him to be heroic, you know, as the Romantics later take him to be, because of this, you know, selfish, you know, narcissism, you know, whatever that Satan has. And Victor is right there. That's how she's writing Victor too, that this is who she's tying him with. So far less Prometheus than Lucifer. So here, so the the chapter ends with a very short paragraph, and actually it's interesting because the 1831 she really expands on this and adds a lot more, and just in issues of time, I don't have time to go into that today. I was hoping to do, so I'm actually going to post about that big change she makes at the end of this chapter. But the way the 1818 edition ends with amiable cousin, such were your thoughts, mild and gentle as your own dear eyes and voice, but I was a wretch, and none ever conceived of the misery that I then endured. I mean, this is just what we're talking about Victor's doing over and over again. I will just say very briefly that in the 1831 revision, we get a little, we get the end of Justine. Like she does write that Justine dies, and there's a little bit there, but then it's, and they talk about how she perished on the scaffold. But it's again, it's also more of Victor talking about, you know, his prophetic soul torn by remorse, horror, and despair.
well, yeah, like Elizabeth basically expresses near suicidal ideation. She says, like, I am, this is so painful to me that I would rather die with you. Like, and then Victor says, your thoughts so mild and gentle were nothing compared to my wretchedness. And it's like, she basically just said she wants to die because this is so painful that she can't cope with it. But sure, your wretchedness.
Yeah.
And I
She's
think
not listening.
it, you know, especially because this is the end of the volume. Like, and if you took this from a circulating library and you only took the first volume, that would be so striking. So for those of you that don't know, a lot of readers would be going to circulating libraries at this point in time. Most circulating libraries allowed you to take three texts. So you could take one novel, but if it was in 4 parts, you could only take 3. And there's often letters of young ladies being like furious because volume 3 of the novel they want is never, they can only get 1 and 2 and they can't seem to get 3, or like volume 1's the only one that's there because someone else is, you know, well, I'll take 1 because I don't know if I'm going to like this, and I'll take 2 of something else. So a lot of people probably, if they didn't buy this, or if volume 2 didn't, you know, the volumes don't always come out at the same time. So for some people, the end of volume 1 would be that they'd be left with that for a period of time before they can read volume 2. So that's really like interesting that that's the moment that she ends that volume on. It's different for us because we're reading this compiled, but imagine the physicality of the text. That is not the final lines of the novel, but it is the final lines of a physical book.
Yeah.
So you would have volume 1 on its own as a physical thing, and that is what you're left with. That is the final page, and that is obviously really striking that you don't get the fact that Justine is hung at the end of this chapter. You get it in the next one, which is also the start of the next volume. I like to kind of draw attention to those
Thank you.
physicalities of these texts, because we forget that this isn't one physical being, you know, it's split into volumes and they are physically separate, and a lot of writers use that physicality to their advantage when they're creating plot and creating suspense and things like that.
We've shared this on, I think, the first episode. I shared the pictures, the images of the 3 volumes, the first edition that we have at the Rosenbach. And it's fascinating with this novel, too, because it's published that way in these 3 volumes. Her manuscript is chaptered and divided much differently. She has it in in I think what 2 volumes in hers.
So.
And but there's a lot more these chapters are shorter, and then she has to redo it all.
Yeah, it's small for a 3-volume novel.
Yeah,
it's very,
very
small for a 3-volume novel.
And then
it's probably done that way for profit.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So good. Well, any final thoughts from you, Mary, on that then?
No, I
Anything
mean,
we didn't hit today?
I think it just, really throws into contrast. So if you are looking at Justine and Elizabeth as doubles, or, in that sense, and the creature and Victor as doubles, the care and the love that the women show towards each other, even in the face of tragedy, and just the complete, just lack of anything from Victor, just absence and no kinds of no love, no care, whether that should be from a familial perspective or from a creator perspective. He just the first emotion is, or the first act is, abandonment. I think that here is a really stark contrast of that. And then I just it's just another example of Victor being awful and being self-obsessed.
And of the lack of, it's like we said, the women are intentionally absent from this novel, and that women are being excluded in this narrative despite the fact they are the ones being disproportionately. Elizabeth loses far much more than Victor does. She's basically raised William. Justine is her close and personal friend. She really is the tragic heroine here. And it's intentionally absent, and that, just like Mary said, it just really starkly highlights it to the reader that this is missing.
All right. Well, Franken readers, thank you all for tuning in today. We will post this recording on our website if that's how you're watching it right now. Thank you for watching. We have a Sundays with Frankenstein Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. I'm always available to answer questions via email. I like that, so please send me an email. Next week's co-host will again be actor and collector Dan Hodge. We're mixing up the order that we've established already, but Dan will be here next week. The first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I just mentioned, is one of the many gems of the Rosenbach's collections. If you're looking for more virtual engagement, you can head on over to the Rosenbach website. You can check out the other virtual offerings we have and the Frankenstein programs we have coming up this spring besides this show. We also have our gallery gateways and exhibitions online. But the Rosenbach's also open right now. You can go online, you can get a time ticket if you live in this area, one party at a time you go through very safely. You can check out our new exhibition on 19th century Japanese sailor Manjiro. Lots of fun things to do. Lauren and Mary, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having us. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And you can find us on Twitter at The Ghoul Guides if you would like to ask us any more questions.
Excellent. Thank you. So I know our chat, Igor Brianna was putting your link in our chat here today, but we also have it on our website, and we have it in the on the Facebook group always. But definitely visit the Ghoul Guides. Are you guys have any new videos up right now, or ones being planned right now?
We are currently planning our next ventures, so good. We are having a little break, and then we will be cooking up some new stuff in our cauldron. We've got some more Ghoul Schools planned. And we are probably going to do some more of those kind of fun, we just call them the chat shit videos, but we will be doing more kind of would you rathers and kiss, marry, kills and things like that.
All righty. I love it. Great stuff. Thank you.
If there's anything you want us to do, any fun videos or any topics you want us to hit, then please tweet us, or just let us know what you want, and we will, especially for Ghoul
School. If there's anything that you think, I have always wondered why this is a thing or what it actually means, let us know and we will do the public service.
Great. Beautiful. I love it. All righty. Well, everyone, join us next week on Sundays with Frankenstein for chapters 1 and 2 of volume 2 of the 1818 edition, When Victor and the Creature Meet. That's going to be very exciting to do. Once again, will be played out by Tucker Christine's Pleated Gazelle song, It's Alive, over our ending credits. And farewell, divine wanderers. Remember, you have hope and the world before you. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
I have some candy for